That stopped for a reason that I don't know, but thankfully I noticed it pretty soon. So this is going, hopefully, and it won't cut out again. So that was my intro, and now we talk about the actual notes. So we're going to start with key trends in dramatic literature, talk about what the content was that they performed, how that changed, alongside, now we get all of these technical improvements that we're going to talk about as well. So first we have key trends in dramatic literature. Religious influence starts to give way to an emphasis on what is called humanism, which is a focus on the importance of human lives and affairs as opposed to that of divine beings. So early on, way early on, all theater, as we called it, was born out of these religious ceremonies and rituals, right? Trying to maybe beseech the gods or tell stories of the gods. Even as you move into the Greeks and Romans, they are often still telling the stories of the gods themselves. Or if you're talking about something more Christian, it's about capital G, God, Jesus, whatever they're doing. But instead, as you move into the Middle Ages, into 1800, you start to move away from those sorts of things into people and the stories of people. And hey, we're enough. We're interesting enough to write a story about without bringing, the gods into it and all these different divine beings. Comic plays and serious plays began to be mixed in the Middle Ages, and it continued, especially in Commedia dell'arte and Elizabethan plays. So if you have ever read a Shakespeare play, all of you, I think, should have read Romeo and Juliet. If you have, I'm going to tell your English teacher, if you have not. If you have, then you'll know that there are often moments, even in tragedies, of comic relief, where instead of just being downer, tragedy, there are chunks where you're supposed to laugh and you're supposed to smile. And those have some really cool effects in terms of, the effect that the sad parts will have on you when you can laugh a little bit at the same time. Hopefully we are all learning to laugh now when it's kind of a tragedy, alongside all of that, and help us feel joy again. And that's what began to happen more. Back with the Greeks, we talked a lot about how there were festivals for tragedies, festivals for comedies, right? Those would hardly ever be mixed. You would never have maybe what we would call a dramedy now in those times, because that's just not the way that they thought about it. Tragedy was for tragedy, comedy was for comedy. And these rigid rules, let's move to the next point. Over time, there was movement away from observing the classic unities of time and place and rigid dramatic rules. So the classic unities of time and place they were invented by a guy named Aristotle. He's a Greek philosopher who wrote in his Poetics that it was very important that plays have a unity of time and place, by which he meant that they should be in one location over a short period of time. Some plays took this to the absolute extreme and only performed basically what would actually be able to happen in the actual time that it took for the play to be performed in one space. There are some modern examples of plays that tried to do this. They're not nearly as popular. Long time ago, when I was still in high school and in college, there was a show called 24 with Kiefer Sutherland. It was a 24-episode show that all took place over 24 hours. And so they would not observe unity of place at all. They'd go all over the place. But in those 24 hours, every episode would be 1 hour. So it would start, midnight to 1 a.m. And even in between commercials, however long the commercials were, there was a little timer that went at the end of every single commercial break and the beginning of every single segment of the show that would allow for that time, so you would see how much time has passed. It's a pretty cool concept that we are watching all of this happen in one day. The answer is no. I have never actually marathoned it in a single 24-hour period, although now that's kind of what I want to do. Tune in for Mr. Mathis watches 24 hours of 24. I'm live streaming it on Twitch. Be there, be square. Leave a comment on my YouTube. Next. Sorry. So I never finished that earlier thought. Of course I didn't, because I got onto a tangent. Even when you're not here, I get onto tangents. The unities of time and place started getting played around, and one of those rigid dramatic rules had to do with the not mixing of tragedy and comedy into what might be called a tragicomedy. Now, when I say things like rules, I don't mean they're never broken. Obviously, some people played with it, and if you read some old Greek plays that are tragedies, there might be times where there's a little bit of a witty line, but it wasn't nearly as common as it would be later. Once you finally get to the Restoration period, which is about mid-1600s to late 1700s, the really popular versions of plays were called comedies of manners, and they wittily satirized artificial and pompous behaviors. If you're familiar at all with Oscar Wilde, he wrote The Importance of Being Earnest, amongst many other things, but The Importance of Being Earnest and those sorts of things kind of play with societal rules and make fun of people who are too wrapped up in those sorts of rules, people who are hypocrites, who act one way in one group of people and another way for real, and who hold people to an unrealistic standard. It's kind of... I'm trying to think of a modern parallel. It's sort of similar, perhaps, to like a reality TV show in which you see multiple sides of a person, like the Real Housewives, where they're almost making fun of themselves. I don't know. This is probably a bad example. I should have thought of this before I started talking. But if I think of another one, I'll let you know. Importance of Being Earnest is a great example of a comedy of manners written during this period. We're going to talk about some key figures in technical theater. So there were a lot of advancements made in terms of our ability to create art and to create spaces. And some of that obviously went into theater because humans love theater. If there's anything that we will learn, it's that no matter what, humans want to perform for each other and tell stories to each other. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. So Filippo Brunelleschi, he discovers how to use linear perspective and the idea of a vanishing point to create the illusion of three-dimensional space on a flat surface, which revolutionizes stage scenery. He also created the dome of the cathedral in Florence. I have a link you could click on that dome. It's pretty impressive. I think it's the largest or the second largest dome in existence. It's enormous. If you have a chance to go to Florence and see it, I strongly recommend that you do. If you're not familiar with art class, basically the idea of linear perspective is as you're looking at something that goes far away, all lines will converge on a single point at some imaginary space in the distance. So the vanishing point isn't really a real specific thing, but it's the idea that basically things that are up close look one way and things that are farther look a little bit smaller, right? They're not actually smaller. We know that once we walk up to them, they will look bigger, but visually they look smaller. This was really challenging to actually create. If you look at a lot of old art from the Middle Ages, a lot of, especially in churches, you'll see pictures of paintings of people that are up close and the person is one size, and then there'll be a person who's far away, but they're the same size, and it'll give this impression that some people were giants during this time. But that's just because that skill, which is a challenging skill, if any of you are not drawers, you will know, or you might not know, that it is incredibly challenging to accurately create perspective in a consistent and good way. This was a huge jump forward, and it allowed scenery to look much realer, and it made, if I put behind me a tree, that's one thing, but if I can create a whole wooded space behind my actors, it helps increase that suspension of disbelief, which makes me believe more that I'm watching something that is, real and more affecting that way. We use this sort of tool all the time today. If you've ever been to Disneyland and you've gone to down Main Street or to the castle, they use this linear perspective, these rules of linear perspective, to force your perspective to make things look like they are taller than they actually are. So if you look at the houses on Main Street and the little businesses that they have, the windows on top are actually a little bit smaller than they would be normally. Like they're a little bit smaller than the windows on the bottom, and that's to give the impression that they're actually higher than they are. Same thing is happening with the castle. Each level is just a little bit scaled down so that it looks a little bit taller and more impressive, adding to the magic and mystery of Disney. Andrea Palladio designed the Teatro Olimpico. I speak perfect Italian, thank you, which reflects classical Roman theater design. It's huge theater. Check out that link. It's really, really cool. Then you've got Pellegrino di San Daniele, who uses perspective backdrop for a staging of Ariosto's The Casket. You might be noticing at this point that a lot of these figures are Italian or have Italian names, and that's because the Italian Renaissance is actually one of the first in Europe that happened. So when you think about the Renaissance, it happened at different stages for different areas. Italy is often considered the earliest starting point. They had their Renaissance around 15th, 16th century or so, followed by England, Spain, and France later. France and England especially kind of have the latest Renaissance after Italy's Renaissance. And so a lot of these engineering... What does that sound? Maybe a lawnmower. Sorry. I'm not going to edit this, so you're welcome for all of these moments. The engineering feats that helped make theaters more impressive and performances more engaging happened by the Italians. However, we've got James Burbage coming up next. He constructed the theater. Very humble man naming his theater the theater, but it was the very first public Elizabethan playhouse in the wooden O style. So if you've ever gone to the Old Globe in San Diego, in Balboa Park, they're putting out a ton of really cool content, by the way. If you want to check out the Old Globe's website, I strongly recommend it. So that style of basically you have the stage here as a thrust, and then you've got a ground area where you've got the groundlings that can stand there, the really cheap seats for the poorest and drunkest patrons. And then you've got seats that you can pay for in 3 tiers. So there's 3 levels, and then there's actually seats that you can sit on there. That is the wooden O style of the theater. And that helps. The reason it's in a circle has to do with sound waves. So we talked a little bit about sound when we talked about the Greeks, but when you're trying to create something smaller in a city where you can't build it into a hill like the Greeks often did, you need to figure out the way to help sound travel more easily, because they're not dealing with mics, and unless you want to have people standing there with like megaphones or whatever, you need some way to do it. And a circle, reflects sound much more easily, helps bring people in closer to the action so that they can hear your actors talking. And Inigo Jones introduced movable perspective scenery. So you've got Brunelleschi, who really utilized first that perspective scenery in a backdrop in a single space. And now you've got Inigo Jones using movable perspective scenery where you can bring those things and move them around. The proscenium arch, proscenium style stage, as you know, is one where there's only one actors on one side and the audience only looking from one side of the stage. And the proscenium arch is the thing in front of it that you can hang curtains from, that you can design and do a lot of different things with, and colored lighting, actually, to English theater. This is a pretty big deal. They didn't have light bulbs then, right? They had flames. And so coming up with a safe way to reliably have different colors in your theater is pretty impressive. You've got key trends in technical theater next. So those are key figures, and these are some key trends. And these are going to kind of overlap a little bit, but I wanted to make sure that you got those names just because I couldn't live with myself as a drama teacher if you didn't actually know any of these names. So key trends in technical theater. In the Middle Ages, elaborate stage devices developed. So pageant wagons brought action closer to the audience. So you've got these traveling troops of actors now traveling with a wagon that will literally unpack, I don't know the best way to say it, in such a way that that is the stage that they perform on. And so it makes it easy to travel from town to town, and it makes it easy to, hey, I've got an audience of 5 right here. Boom, here we are. We're watching it. And more accessible for the masses that way as well. Once you get to the Renaissance, there's an increasing use of movable perspective scenery, which again was introduced by Inigo Jones up there. The raked stage, if you remember from the very beginning of this year, back when we still met in person, a raked stage is one where downstage is literally down and upstage is literally up, and that helps everybody see the actors more easily. And proscenium arch and mechanized staging. Mechanized staging is it's not a trick, right? Mechanized staging is using a machine to move scenery in and out, and have platforms that raise and trapdoors that fall and things like that. Platforms that spin around, that sort of thing. Open air Elizabethan playhouses changed to circular or octagonal. Open air means open area. If you ever go to London and you have a chance to go to the Old Globe, Shakespeare's Old Globe, which is not the original, obviously, but a reconstruction of it, it is open air. I've been to plays there where it rains, and guess what? You stand in the rain and you get wet. It was actually kind of gross. The drains clogged up for me when I was there. And it rained pretty hard, and we were all standing in like ankle deep water in our shoes, but it was so fun and so neat. Strong recommend. Go see that if you ever get a chance. It's super fun. Elaborate indoor restoration theaters. So we're going to talk about exactly why this change happened a little bit later, but elaborate indoor restoration theaters had a pit, so an orchestra pit where you could play music. There were tiers of galleries with box seats, like the one that Abe Lincoln died in, and a white apron in front of the curtain, so that everything, by the time we get to the restoration, a lot of the trends that you probably are used to seeing as a theater, that's when they start to come. Okay, so those are some key things to pay attention to, and now we're going to get into some more specifics. So in medieval times, which is kind of, the term is out of vogue now. You don't really use medieval anymore. But in the medieval period, which are the Middle Ages, that's where we're going to start. So after burying drama when Rome fell in 476 AD, the church resurrected it around the 9th century when it introduced the trope. A trope is a short dramatized scene into the mass. Now we know trope as this obvious thing that you see over and over again in movies. So it's similar to a stock character. I'm sure that we've discussed tropes in class before, but it's basically this repeated idea that happens in multiple plays, multiple TV shows, multiple movies. At this point, a trope would be something like a character who dies and is resurrected. So you've got Neo in The Matrix. You have a bunch of examples of that character who you think is dead and then comes back. Gandalf in Lord of the Rings. And that all stems from the death and resurrection of Christ, which a lot of those people are alluding to and playing off of. So that's where we get the trope from. At first, brief Easter and nativity tableaus. Tableaus are representations of a scene performed by motionless people in costume. Those were given to help the illiterate congregation understand the service. So the church was kind of over a barrel here because nobody could read. Nobody could, even if you could read, you probably couldn't read Latin, which is the only language that the church held its services in. And so when they're trying to explain what's going on to the congregation, they get bored just like we get bored. And just telling them, just talking, is nowhere near as interesting as having some visual for them to look at. And so you have people in costume acting out, the death of Christ, the resurrection. You have all of you have seen a nativity tableau. I am certain of it by virtue of you living in a big city, because you've seen the infant Christ in the manger. You've seen Mary and Joseph, the three wise men. That is a tableau. Perhaps you've even seen a living nativity, and that's a real tableau where people will just stand motionlessly and they will represent a scene. It's almost like a living painting. It's a slippery slope letting people perform, because people decide that I like to watch things and not just hear about them. And so those tableaus of motionless people to help the illiterates understand the service led to pantomimes, where you would act, you know what a pantomime is, and not say anything, which soon gave way, unfortunately, fortunately for us, to dialogue, first in Latin, which was the language of the church, and then finally the common language. And these scenes became so popular that whole stories began to be enacted. That slippery slope, the church letting people get what they want through performances. Ultimately, you get three kinds of plays here. Mystery plays that are reenacted Bible stories, miracle plays that are lives of the saints, and morality plays, which are stories that teach right from wrong. So mystery, the reason they're called mystery plays is the Bible is supposed to reveal the mysteries. It is the great mystery. And so mystery plays reveal this mysterious truth that the Bible is telling us through some of these stories. Miracle plays, lives of the saints, in order to become ordained. Not ordained, that's not the right word. Maybe I'll think of it. In order to be named a saint, this is going to kill me. I have to look it up. In order to be named a saint, you have to do, excuse me, you have to have a few different things that need to happen, including performing miracles while you're alive and miracles after you've died. Canonized is what it's called. By the way, I looked it up. You could probably hear my keyboard click-clacking. And that's why they're called miracle plays. And then morality plays, obviously, right from wrong is morality. The classic morality play, the first that everybody kind of points to, is called Everyman, and it is still performed to this day. It is an allegory that is not subtle. Subtlety is not its strong point. It was meant to be a very clear depiction of what you should do and understand as good and right. An allegory is a play in which everything has a one-to-one comparison with the real world. So in this case, the main character, Everyman, who stands for every man and woman, journeys to a place called death. He is left by his friends worldly goods. I'm sorry, I'm laughing because it's just so straightforward. And so worldly goods leave him, but only good deeds follow him to the grave. You can see how this was definitely just to teach you about how you should act, how the church thought that you should act at the time. Originally, the plays were performed in the cathedrals, but crowds became so large that in the 13th and 14th centuries, the stages, which were called mansions at the time, were moved outside to the marketplace. And when things finally got out of the church, things got way more comedic, way more exaggerated, and way more wild. So Herod, a man who helped lead to the death of Jesus Christ in the Bible, became a devil. That's where you get a lot of the imagery that you now connect with that. Along with art happening, these plays are where you started to get it. So, pitchfork, red, tail, ears, hooves, things like that is where you get those sorts of things. Herod became a devil. Noah's wife stubbornly refuses to enter the ark and goes inside kicking and screaming, apparently preferring to drown. Devils with pitchforks prod the wicked. And you get all of this imagery that you are most used to at this point. Then, in the Middle Ages, the Passion Play developed. A Passion Play is a type of mystery play, but it's specifically scenes from Christ's life, which is particularly in the last days of his suffering and resurrection. The Passion of the Christ is meant to refer to the suffering and resurrection of Christ. If you have ever seen the Mel Gibson movie, The Passion of the Christ, it's a super intense, as realistic as possible look at the final days of Jesus, which are pretty rough and torture-y. So if you want to watch that, you can, but it is intense. Content warning. Interestingly, there's a small German town called, I'm going to mess this up, Oberammergau, which still performs the Passion Play every single year in a nearly unbroken streak. After 300 years, they're still doing this. They promised that they would do this. They prayed for their village to be spared from a plague, the Black Plague specifically, which killed 2/3 of people in Europe at the time. They prayed that their village be spared from the Black Plague, and it was. And in 1633, they performed their first Passion play, and true to their word, they have almost every single year. The only time they were unable to do it was in 1940. Not every year, every 10 years. The only time they weren't able to do it was in 1940 during World War II because of the war, World War II, the war that I just mentioned, which is pretty wild. Thousands of people go to see that now, and this is a crazy, crazy long streak that they have. Okay, so that is medieval theater, Middle-Age theater, as you might know it. And you might notice an interesting pattern here. We start at very, very religious. We move to a little bit more humanist, but very slowly, right? When we come back, everything is still focused on religion. There are a lot of different reasons that could be, but a primary one is probably centered around what people go to religion for, right? Whatever religion you are, you go to religion to get some major questions about your life answered. How did I get here? What is my purpose? What is good? What is bad? People want to know the answers to these questions, and religion offers that. And so it's perhaps not surprising that the church has been a very powerful institution throughout time, and our performances tend to be connected to that. All right, I'm going to cut the video off here just so that I'm not uploading things that are too big, and maybe it'll be easier to find my videos. So I'm going to talk about Renaissance theater in the next video.